Okay.
All right, we'll start that again. How are you doing?
I'm doing great and wonderful introductions.
Great. All right. So, one of the things I've always admired about your work is not only you've got a great business acumen and a big fan of Coda, but you've got this incredible talent of looking at the analog world of human collaboration and communication and being able to convert it into essentially digital systems, methods and processes that people can understand and put into practice and build out at scale. But this all starts with what a ritual is. So why don't we start out with how do you define what a ritual is, and maybe give us an example so we can use that to frame the conversation.
Yeah, sounds good. And I think we're gonna have a lot of fun talking about rituals. It's one of my favorite words. And I'll give a little bit of credit. The insight for this has become one of my main projects for the year. And the insight behind this came out of a podcast I did last August with Reid Hoffman and Masters of Scale. And the way they tape these podcasts is kind of fun. You sit for like 3 hours and talk about all sorts of different things. And then they cut it down into a 30-minute episode. And it's the same producers who produced TED, and they're quite good at it. And so they picked out this one line out of that, and they sort of redid the whole podcast around that. And they focused on this word ritual. And they started with this quote from old friend and close advisor named Bing Gordon. And if people don't know Bing, he's one of the Valley's iconic entrepreneurs, the early at EA. He's now an investor in many different companies. Sits on the board of Amazon and so on. Right. But he has this frame for this topic that I really love. His view is every great teams have a small list of golden rituals, is what he calls them, and they have 3 criteria. Number 1, they are named. Number 2, every employee knows them by their first Friday on the job. And number 3, they are templated. And he uses all sorts of examples for this. Amazon has 6-pagers. Google has OKRs. Salesforce has V2 Mom. And as you look at iconic companies, you'll often find these rituals. And I've started through my vantage point at Coda, I get the opportunity to interact with thousands of different companies. We have about 30,000 different teams using Coda now, and I get to see the breadth of how people's rituals are constructed. Right. So we started collecting up a set of these. Maybe I'll start with an example.
Yeah.
Notice my video got fuzzy. I'm going to see if I can fix that. Let's see. We're going to have lots of AV issues today, huh?
This is the live virtual events world that we live in. Anything's possible, right?
yeah. I'm not totally sure why that happened. Well, we'll see if it fixes itself. Let me start with an example, and I'll show you one of ours. And I'll just share my screen quickly and let's see if I can do this right. Okay, can you see my screen?
It's firing up. Here we go. We're good to go.
Okay, great. And so the one, this, by the way, this doc is the companion doc for that episode of the podcast. The example that I always start with is a Coda example, and this one is
just before you go on, could you increase the text size a little bit so everybody can see it?
Yes, please.
That'd be great. I'll tell you when. Keep going. Stop. There we go. Perfect.
Oh, one less. Okay, there we go. This is Dory and Paul's. If you join the Coda team and make it to your first Friday and haven't seen this 20 times, I'd be quite surprised. And it's sort of iconic to how we run the company. Originally started with us being a fairly distributed team, but has become a key part of our culture. I'll just describe quickly how it works. So a Dory is basically a ranked Q&A, and you can come into any Coda doc and you can type /Dory and it'll give you a table like this. The way it works is people add their questions and they say, should we do this interview with _? And everybody can go and upvote and downvote the questions. Very simple idea. What do we get out of it? Well, we get a few things. First off, it equalizes our audience. It means that I'm sure everybody's been in a meeting where the person who dominates the meeting is the loudest person or the highest paid person or the most senior person or whatever it might be. So this gives a voice to everybody in the company. You discuss what matters. So you walk out of the meeting and you say, we didn't get through everything, but we got through everything with at least 3 upvotes, and we feel pretty good about it. And it actually turns out you get better form questions, which is kind of interesting. We generally pair Dory with this other technique we call Pulse. And the way Pulse works is similar. You can hit /Pulse in a document, you'll get one of these as well. The way Pulse works is we generally have a question. So we'll say, should we ship this thing? And we'll say, absolutely we should. Metrics are great. And what you'll notice is when you check this box, you can see everybody's replies. So everybody fills it out privately, and then we see everybody else's pulse. And the primary reason we do this is to avoid groupthink. Again, I'm sure everybody's been in a meeting where you go around the room and you want to hear, should we launch this feature? And first person says yes, second person says yes, third person says yes. Now the fourth person is completely stuck and has no choice but to say yes. And so you get a much clearer view of where the team stands. So this is a very common ritual at Coda, Dory Pulse. Stop sharing. And is one good example. The thing I love about rituals like these is not only are they effective at driving, in this case, more effective meetings and collaboration, but they often become iconic for your culture, and they represent a way that your culture operates. And it's definitely, anyone who's been close to Coda would say that sense of great ideas can come from anywhere is baked into our culture.
So going back to your Bing quote, you've named it. You've named those two as an example. They've been templated in Coda. And for people who are watching this for the first time, who are not familiar with Coda, Coda is an incredibly powerful platform for building all kinds of business workflow. I'd like to dig in a little bit into the second point of Bing's quote, which is every employee knows them by the first Friday. And I think this is one of the challenges that so many people face with any kind of business processes or rituals is actually getting people to use them. So what have you learned in not just getting them to use them by that first Friday, but having them continue to use them and actually they become a real part of the business fabric?
Yeah, I mean, I do think so some of these happen by accident. So I mean, I think that it's very interesting watching. I do these interviews with companies now. My goal is to publish 100 rituals from the 100 best companies, and so I'm working through. I've gotten through about 80 of them, and in some cases, people do it very purposefully. And I want this change in behavior, and they'll go and deploy it. Oftentimes, it happens by accident, and something will happen, and it just sort of feels like, oh, that's how this runs. And it's sort of interesting when that happens. But the other two parts of Bing's quote are really important. In most cases, they are named. And it's interesting the names people come up with them. It's to use Salesforce as an example. V2MOM is not an easy to come up with name, but it's very sticky, right? And it's just the acronym for the 5 parts of the write up. But the naming actually helps a lot. And I think people often underestimate. We think a lot about branding for products and companies and so on, but actually your internal rituals have the same need for branding. And then the other side of it is being templated. And I think making it easy to use them is really important. I mean, the Dory Pulse is our example. You can hit /Dory or /Pulse in any Coda document, and you can just create one of these. Actually, in Coda, you can actually create your own custom templates like that. And so for your own company, you can come in and say whatever your ritual is, and you can turn it into a / command, and it'll just work in your Coda doc, which is super cool. But even without Coda, I've seen companies do it with document templates and spreadsheet templates and so on that just sort of codify what is their best practice. But it's interesting watching how many different ways these have evolved for people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, Michael says, for example, just in the chat, that Underscore have used it as part of the onboarding. And that's one of the things I love about what you're talking about here is that it breaks this complex world into easy to understand chunks that people can wrap their heads around. So just before I go on to the next question, again, folks, if you're, watching this, you've got Shishir available in front of you as well. We're going to have some dedicated audience Q&A in a little bit. Get your questions, your thoughts, your comments, anything into the chat. Now, there is, again, I'm kind of going back to Bing's quote because I think it's a really nice way of framing this discussion. There's kind of a piece before that, right? Which is of all of the things that you can create rituals out of, which of the things that we focus on? And I imagine there are some people here watching today and thinking, okay, Shishir's an expert in this. He's been doing this for years. He knows exactly what he's doing. I'm running my business. Where do I start? Like, where do I focus the ritual ray gun on? how do you, what would you recommend as a good place for people to get started with just doing what you're talking about here and getting up and running?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I've been, as part of this project, been interviewing these companies, and I found that I asked companies, what are your golden rituals? And as people bring them back, I found that they naturally fit in 4 primary categories. And actually, I think we prepared a companion doc for this today. So I'll stick the link in the chat, and we can talk about them. There's sort of 4 primary ways that I've seen people respond to this, and we can go through some of the different areas. Some people focus their rituals on a very common one is how they run strategy and planning. So people say this is our process for deciding what we're going to work on. How do we set our goals? How do we keep on track? So on. That's B2Mom and Google OKRs and so on.
OKRs,
all great examples. There's a second class of rituals that I think focus on execution and how teams operate day to day, week to week. I would put Dory and Pulse in that category. And there's all sorts of interesting examples of how we communicate together. People have all sorts of interesting tricks and techniques that have turned into these rituals. The third set I generally see are in how people form or run the team themselves. How they many companies have iconic rituals for how they recruit, how they manage performance, how they do team building activities, but actually, you're working with the team members directly. So I think that's the third category. And the fourth one, which I was surprised how often this has come up, is I normally call it personal productivity, but it's a set of rituals where people have observed that the overall function of the company is better when every individual is personally productive. And one of my best phrases for this was your team's productivity is upper bounded by your own. And I've seen companies deploy these systems for managing personal productivity as well, which is interesting. So those sort of 4 different areas: how you do strategy and planning, how you run your execution, how you form a great team, and how you manage your personal productivity. In terms of where do you point your ray gun, it depends it depends which of those areas you have the most challenge in. I mean, my suspicion is companies will naturally grow rituals in all 4 areas. But I've sort of seen a mix of where people choose to start.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of a conversation I had one time with the CEO of Mattermost, Ian, and he was saying, when the way he looks at how he's built his business is he looks at where is the most productive energy spent, and that he tries to focus on rituals and processes as a means to speed up and automate and take the pain out of the areas where people don't get energy, where people don't get that kind of motivation and passion in their bones. So maybe that could be a good place to begin. One thing I would like to understand a little bit here as well is, and I'm sure people watching this have experienced this too, is that you create a ritual or a process, you put it into action, and you're almost guaranteed that first implementation of that ritual is going to be okay at best, but it's going to need to evolve and improve, right? And in the spirit of, for example, software engineering, code improves and changes and iterates. How have you approached that specifically at Coda? So if we use, for example, Dory and Pulse, I'm sure that they probably started out life in a very different way. How do you ritual hack, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention it. And I think it's one of the key parts of the Bing's frame for this of golden rituals. Once you recognize what they are, you spend forever improving them, right? The OKR process that Google has turned around many, many times. I mean, to pick a specific example for us with Dory Pulse, one of the things we've adopted is it was a small but very meaningful change. Is in our Dory we now hide the question asker column, and it's it was yet another step towards the feeling of inclusion. What we found was people would look through the list, and even though you could upvote and downvote anything, you were distracted by looking at, well, who asked the question? And so we actually added a feature that turned the person's name into just their picture, so it was like smaller and more subtle. And then we added another feature that hides it, and we call it unbiased Dory. And then when we actually do the process, we ask people to ask questions again. I've seen people take these and turned them into all sorts of different mechanisms. To take that Dory Pulse example, a very similar technique got deployed at Spotify. And in that case, I sit on the board there, and Daniel saw this and decided to adopt it for the board meeting, which is kind of interesting in itself. As board meetings, I think, are a very interesting cultural melting pot, because you end up with, in that case, 10 different people from 10 completely different companies. And so you get this kind of mix of rituals, and Ted Sarandos is there from Netflix, and Tom Staggs is there from Disney, and Heidi O'Neill's there from Nike, and so you get this kind of mix of different people. And they started one thing that I thought was interesting was, asking the person who wrote the question to just ask it themselves. They have to say it verbally, and it's a little tweak again on that process that sort of changed that dynamic a lot. So I do think iteration on it is super important, and it becomes very natural when you name it. It just becomes a natural part of, oh, well, that's the thing we're known for. How do we make it better? And it becomes like the products you make better every day.
I guess you have a ritual for improving the rituals, right? How meta can we get with this?
That's right.
One of the things I think a lot of employees in businesses often struggle with is when they feel like they're not involved in the shape and the culture of a business, right? It's kind of like, we've all heard these horror stories of small groups of people forming into a room to create a set of values, and then the values get put in a mahogany frame and hung above the restroom and never looked at again. How have you approached, and what would you recommend to our viewers here, making sure that you do have people from all walks of life in your business playing a role in that, and not just leadership, not just management, not just the people who are favorable to that ritual, but really encouraging a culture of people saying, you know what, this bit of our ritual really sucks, but we can fix it, we can improve it. How do you make sure that there's a room at the table for everybody?
Yeah, the values one is a very interesting one, and I've seen a couple rituals for forming values, and then rituals to amplify them that have been interesting. We've seen a few companies deploy a technique. Actually, Google Ventures started a technique called the 3-hour brand sprint, which sounds crazy, that you could define a brand in 3 hours, but it's actually an amazingly effective technique. And it started by John Zaratsky and Jake Knapp. They wrote a book on it called Sprint, which is quite good as well. And many of those are available as Coda templates as well. But we did our values at Coda that way. And it was a very interesting exercise. Got everybody together for 3 hours, divided the entire company up into little groups of 4 or 5 people, and then ran their process. And then we did it in sort of a reverse tree fashion, where every group there's a set of exercises you do to come up with these first you come up with value words, and then you come up with value statements that you wish you had, ones that describe you well, and you kind of work your way up through this. And then you put those groups vote on what they think the top set are, and then they get together in slightly bigger groups, and you kind of work your way up, and you end up with a list. So I've seen some pretty interesting techniques that way. In terms of one very memorable ritual is in terms of how people make sure their values actually stick. I mean, my view, values are a thing. Many companies take them and they write them on the wall and put up big posters, and you ask any employee what the values are, and they'll have no idea.
Exactly.
And I don't think that's true at Coda. Actually, I think our 3 values are very well understood by each of our employees, because they're fairly distinctive. At YouTube, we had 10. Talk more about that as well. But one of my favorite interviews was talking to the team at Stripe about this, and they did a really small thing, but they took each of their values and they turned them into emoji reactions or icons, custom icons in Slack. And now people in Slack will often see a statement, and then they'll react, and they'll say, "Oh, that's value number 3." I don't remember actually what their values are, but it'll show up as a reaction, and it just reinforces the behavior and makes it a memorable part of their cadence. So I think that was actually a really interesting technique on how to think about values, particularly.
Yeah, I like that kind of like the visual language of values.
Yes,
never really thought about that. That's interesting. I'm not going to ask you what the emojis were, because
I
guess one way to approach the values thing as well is just force all of your employees to tattoo them on their body. I mean, that would definitely stick. So what is the role of data in this, right? Because when we look at other parts of a business, we we're often incredible, digital marketing, in software engineering, in product, incredibly data driven, and sometimes with rituals and with business and especially culture, there is the view of, well, that's just intangible, right? We can't necessarily measure that. That's just the way we do things around here, which has always struck me as a bit of a cop out in certain situations. Now, one of the things I love about Coda is Coda enables people to glue together different views of a problem with the same data. So how have you gone about using data as a means to influence and adjust and hack on those rituals, as opposed to just people's opinions of those rituals?
I mean, probably the most important thing we do, and I think a lot of companies do this, is we do a standing survey. And maybe backing up a moment, I think companies that have invested in their rituals all share a viewpoint that the company itself is a product. It's a product for producing products. It's a product for producing the right environment for employees. But the company itself is a product, and products get measured. And so you look at different signals for that. When you ship a product to your customers, you'll often do a set of surveys, and might do an NPS survey. Would you recommend this product to someone else? You might do this thing that the Superhuman team made quite famous on the disappointment survey. How disappointed would you be if you couldn't live without this product? We can talk more about that ritual as well, which I think is quite fun. Inside your company, you design a set of questions, and oftentimes is a similar question. Would you recommend Coda as a place to work for someone else, for your closest friend, or so on? And you design a set of these questions. We do that survey very regularly, and so we now do it every quarter. Goes out automatically. It's a very thoughtful write-up, ends up in a Coda doc, of course. And we use that as signal a lot for, is this working or not? And so, as an example, there's a question on there. I'm going to forget the exact phrasing of the question, but it's something like, do the meetings and processes of Coda, or to what degree do the meetings and processes of Coda help you get your work done? And you get a scale from 0 to 5, and people give their answer, and you watch it over time, and you see how it grows and shrinks. It's amazing watching how, when we make changes, how fast these things move. One quarter out, and you'll see this. You'll see everything change. So I do think it's very important to measure, and doing an employee pulse survey or something like that is a quite common way to do it. The other thing we'll do is we'll often do brainstorm sessions in one of our iconic meetings at Coda is called Catalyst. We can talk more about that as well. But the Catalyst is I think most companies would call it their review forum or the decision-making forum. We don't call it a decision-making forum, because the idea is that sometimes we're here to make a decision, sometimes we're here to expand a space, sometimes we're here to get ideas, and so on. And so we do a set of those fairly regularly, where we'll have this discussion kind of openly. Say, in what ways could so you use the measurement to try to decide how you're doing, but you also need to go and solicit ideas. And what are things that Coda is really good at, things that Coda could be better at, and observations from the company. And there's always some part of the company that is quite happy to live with whatever systems are created, but there's always a motivated, passionate group that feels really strongly about these things, and they'll jump in and really help you create as if that was the actual product that we're shipping out to customers. So those are a couple of points.
And you want to unlock those people, right? Because they're going to bring so much. Now, in about 5 minutes, we're going to hand over to the audience Q&A. So folks, get your questions in, because you don't want to listen to me asking questions forever. There's way more interesting questions in your heads than mine. But I want to use some of the time that we've got left, Shishir, just to dig into those 4 buckets that you mentioned earlier on. You mentioned teams, personal productivity, strategy and planning, execution, cadence, and meetings. And I suspect a lot of people who are watching are thinking, okay, I'd like to get a sense of what rituals I should know of and focus on in each of those 4 areas, and what I should consider for my own business. So why don't we spin through each of these 4 areas and give me just the best you've got in terms of what you'd recommend to our audience in what they should do in those areas. So why don't we start out with teams? Like, what do you think is a critical piece to focus on?
Okay. Let me share my screen again, and I'll give some of my favorite examples. Always hard to pick. Kind of like picking your favorite kid. The document in the chat is actually a pretty good compendium. So this is gives a little bit of a background on all the different rituals, and then in each section here it has a list of some of the most fun ones. And so I was just going to pick a couple examples and show you, but feel free to go back through and read and look at any of those. Or if you have things to contribute, please let me know. So okay, we'll start with team. My favorite example in the team category is this one from Square, and it comes from a woman named Jenny Amick. She's a design lead at Square, and not really in a position of authority, but what she did here ended up being very impactful. Square happens to be a big Coda customer. I think there are a few thousand users there now. But the way they grew was through this insight. And she's a design lead, and the insight she started with was her designers kept complaining that they only got meaningful performance feedback a few times a year, basically when they did performance reviews, and they wanted more continuous feedback. The other thing she observed was that every designer had a one-on-one with their boss, and those one-on-ones were almost always done in a Google Doc. She likes to call the forever scroll Google Doc. They all look the same: date, notes, 60 pages long. And somewhere in the middle of that was meaningful performance feedback, and somewhere was great coaching, and it was there, but it was hard to see. And so she turned it into a template. I'll actually show you our take on it, because I think this came from our head of HR at Coda. The way Jenny's technique works is it just takes that forever scroll document and splits it into pages. And this is a very simple feature of Coda. Is it's like a big super Google Doc, but you have pages. Pages are kind of like tabs in the spreadsheet turned sideways. And she always starts, the first one is partnership agreement. And this is the employee and the manager each write down some of their expectations, some of their preferences, some of their style notes, and some joint shared expectations. One of my favorite ones is, if one of us has a conflict, will we reschedule or cancel? And it's a really small one, but it ends up being very important. And then she just sets up separate pages for reviewing goals, tracking development. This is the area for performance feedback. They do a thing at Square they call Square Kudos, where they keep track through the year of interesting, sort of positive things that happened. And then an area for sort of structured meeting notes, and where all of the different pieces go. The thing I love about this, there's a couple things I love about this example. It spread like wildfire, and the reasons, probably obvious. It's so simple to understand. It's a fancy Google Doc, but it's been much better structured. But the thing I really love about it is it amplifies this idea that every manager-employee relationship is different. And not only is every manager different, every employee different, but every edge in that graph is different. And the idea of starting with a partnership agreement, who are we as a unit, I thought was really interesting. So this is my favorite example. I mean, I think people spend millions of dollars on software for doing continuous performance management and forget to go back to, well, how do we run our one-on-ones, and are we empowering our manager-employee pairs to actually have productive conversations? So this is one good example.
And what I love about this as well is, of course, like you said earlier on, Shishir, is that when you create these rituals, they become part of the fabric of the business. You can work on them, you can hack on them, you can improve them, you can change them, and they'll evolve and grow. So we've got a couple of questions on social media before we get into some of the audience Q&A, which I want to make sure we touch on. The first one doesn't have a name attached to this. This was shared. Devin shared this, who's part of the underscore team. Shishir, what is the single most important ritual that you personally have as a leader? Who's your favorite child?
Okay, I've adopted one from someone else. I'll show you. I'll show you my favorite, and this is actually quite an easy question to answer. But it comes from someone else. It comes from Des Traynor. And for people unfamiliar with Des is a iconic entrepreneur himself. He's the co-founder of Intercom, which is a great company. But he also happens to be a fantastic writer. And he writes a lot, and like many writers, he also tweets a lot. And this example started with this tweet, and it kind of changed how I think about personal productivity. So here's Des's tweet. He said, your email is what others think you should work on. Your to-do list is what you think you should work on. And your calendar is usually what you actually work on. How much do they overlap in your world? And he had all these little Venn diagrams for looking at it. And I think, fun tweets, got a whole bunch of people that liked it, and so on. But then he took this and he turned it into a working template. And so the way his template works is there's 3 steps of pre-work. So you set up your to-do list. He has a very simple one here. Then you sync in your email. And this is a feature of Coda we call Packs, allows Coda to integrate with lots of different systems. So in this case, he syncs in his starred Gmail messages. So every time he stars an email in Gmail, it'll the thread will show up here as a row in this table. Then he syncs in his calendar, and similar idea that uses Coda Packs to go sync in your calendar. And so now he's got all 3 of his parts of the Venn diagram in the same document. And then he's got the system. And the way he runs the system is step number 1, you clear your inbox. So you take everything that you start in your email and you either add it to your to-do list or you link it to something already on your to-do list. Then you rearrange your calendar to match. So you take everything now on your to-do list and you make sure it's on your calendar. Then step 3, you run your week, and now your to-do list has 2 new columns. When am I supposed to work on this, and where did it come from? And then finally, at the end of your week, you get this chart, and the chart says what portion of your time was spent on things that had linked to-dos versus didn't, and it gives you a little calculation here of that total. So a few reasons I love this example. But first off, I personally shifted my life to running this way over a year ago now. I have over 52 weeks of data on this. I've learned that any week where this number crosses 50% is a good week for me. And that was one of the most humbling observations I could find, is that only half of my week is spent on things that were on my to-do list at the beginning of the week. The other reason I love this example is, I'm sure everybody has had this experience of seeing a tweet like this. And what do? You like it, you retweet it, maybe it's a blog post and you save it, you have a book. But we take all of these great insights, we stuff them in the back of our head and we do nothing about them. And the thing I love, what Des did here, is I like to say this document is a tweet that's been compiled into software. I think this is a better to-do list and time manager than anything I've ever seen on the app stores or in any of the galleries or so on. And I like to say that if you can tweet it, you can create it. And I think that's a big part of what we're doing at Coda, is allowing people to do that. But this personal system has totally changed how I work. I've since seen, once this doc got published, I had this other fun observation, is this went out to a bunch of companies, and I've seen a few companies adopt this as a company-wide ritual. And there's a company called Plato HQ that does something like this, that it's a way that they can tell, how aligned everybody is, and they use it as a test for the company, is, what portion of the time of spent by the company are individual spending on the most important priorities. So this, I think it's both an individual great ritual, but can be deployed at a company level as well.
Yeah, I love it. And for people watching, again, if you're not very familiar with Coda, don't think of Coda as just an alternative to Google Docs. Coda is, to use Shishir's example here, instead of just learning a ritual and a process, Coda has the ability to actually do the work inside of the document in a diverse range of ways. It becomes a really it becomes a fundamental UI to how you can run your business. All right, we've got some more questions here, which I want to make sure we get through. So Roy Rachimamov asks, how frequently do rituals change or evolve?
I do think there's an interesting, if you use Bing's test literally and you say, rituals are the set of things that, and I would encourage people, take your company, find the set of people who joined last week, and ask them, what's unique about the company that is different than most of the other companies you look at, and they'll rattle it off. I mean, your new employees will tell you these are your rituals, and you may think that it's something else, but they will often know faster than anyone else, and they'll hopefully talk about it proudly if they're excited about joining the company. Right. So there is sort of a there's sort of a cap. I mean, you can't have too many, and there's a so a lot of the evolution will happen within those. How often do they change? I mean, great companies evolve their rituals like they evolve their products. And I think, let me pick another example. One of my, I'll show one more. This is another favorite of mine. This is from Figma, and Figma is one of my favorite products. We're a big Figma shop. Actually, turns out Coda was the first Figma customer, which Dylan told me about years after. I didn't realize, but they also happen to run a very interesting product process. They happen to do it on Coda, but this is a document. Yuki's the head of product there, published on how Figma ships product. The document itself is amazing. It's one of the most popular documents in our gallery. But this one I think is one of the most interesting processes in this document. And so this is a picture of how they run a weekly launch meeting. And this is a meeting I'm sure almost every company has something like this. It's like, what's going out this week? Is it on track? Is it not on track? And so on. And usually it's one of the most boring meetings of the week. Right? You get together, and as your company grows, inevitably there's 20 people in the room, and while one person talks, 19 other people do their email, and then you kind of work your way around the room. And so he adjusted this process in a very small and subtle way. He added 2 columns here, one for press this button if you have a question, another one press this button if you like this lunch. And almost by accident, he created the question button. You can only click once, but the heart button you can click as many times as you want. And all of a sudden, this meeting, the tone of this whole meeting shifted. And now people come in here, and there's a little bit of competitive juice on giving out likes to each of the different launches, and also in sort of lobbying for them. Look at this thing we're doing. You should like it. It's really awesome. Here's what's coming out, and it just sort of changed how that meeting or that ritual will happen. And good fast moving teams are shipping fast enough that it's hard for the team to keep up. But this was a way to connect everybody back together and give some signal in this what was previously a very boring ritual. So I think they evolve constantly and often in like small unexpected ways change the nature of a ritual pretty substantially.
Yeah, wonderful. Just before we go, because I know we got sidetracked a little bit into some of these wonderful audience questions, but earlier on I was asking you about your recommendations for teams, personal productivity, strategy and planning and execution, and as Shishir showed earlier on his screen, be sure to go and check out the companion Coda document for this session, and those tabs at the top that you can see. There's a whole load of information in here that you should definitely go and check out, because I know we're not going to be able to get through it all in today's session. We do have a question from Steven Zakur, who asks, as an early stage company, my first reaction when presented with the notion of rituals was, we don't have any. But of course we don't. Most are execution focused. Most started without real intention that they'd be done in a certain way, but they are. What is a way of thinking about which are the iconic rituals? How do you select the ones that everyone should know by their first Friday?
And I should say, by the way, I'm going to get the quote backwards, but the good artists borrow, great artists steal. Like I don't think this is a thing where they need to be completely unique. Even little twists on how someone else does something is important. And I'm sure you have more rituals than you think. I mean, the no company can run without them. And sometimes it's as simple as what's your meeting cadence for the week, and we'll see people say, well, this is a company that has a lot of meetings or has very few meetings, or this is a company that meetings are all sort of public by default or not, and each of those things just turn into how the company operates, and your new employees will tell you about them. So it's quite unlikely that you don't have any. In terms of strategically picking which ones to deploy, I would start by borrowing, and you go find, I like the way the Figma team operates, and I like the way Des does this, or I think Square does a great job at managing employees, and you can deploy them and see which ones stick. And some of them will stick, and some of them will get organ rejection, and people will say that's not us. Our company operates differently than that. But I do think it's if you again think about your company as a product itself. Then you think about it as, I'm going to add this element. One of our favorite rituals, Coda, is how we run our hackathons. And early on, we really struggled with this. I don't know why I keep getting fuzzy like that, but hopefully it'll come back in a second.
I think it's just autofocus.
Yeah, it's more aggressive now than it has been before. We have this culture of hackathons, and the it's very interesting how it works. I would not be understating it to say that 75% of our best ideas in Coda have come out of hackathons, which I think is kind of crazy. Back when I was running the YouTube team, we had a thing called Innovation Week, and it was once a year, and it kind of sucked. And very, very few good ideas really came out of it. Probably led to more headache and heartache than it did actually good forward progress. And we eventually stopped doing it. It was so ineffective. But for a variety of reasons, it's worked at Coda. And actually, the thing that made it work at Coda was somebody suggested a rule that initially I thought was kind of crazy, but ended up being quite important. Our hackathons have a rule, which is by default, you're not allowed to ship. And it seems a lot of companies have hackathons where the whole goal is ship something in 2 days. Our hackathons at Coda, you're not allowed to ship, and it just freed everybody up. All of a sudden, the ideas got a little riskier. There's not as much pressure. The team dynamics are a lot better. It's like, is that a good idea or a bad idea? It doesn't really matter. It's only 2 days. We'll try it out and we'll see what happens. If it doesn't work, it's okay. And it flipped a ritual that didn't work for me in a past environment in something that did work for me in this environment. And so I would take that process, go borrow from others, find what you think is helpful. Obviously, the guide I gave is hopefully a helpful start at that. And be open to the idea that maybe this will work, maybe it won't, maybe a small adjustment will make it fit our process, and you'll see how it evolves.
So George Whitfield follows up, hot on the heels of Stephen, says, a follow on from Stephen's question, what rituals do you find are especially useful to early stage startups, and how do you see these evolve over time as the company grows? Now, I think we've already talked a little bit about the evolution piece, but maybe are there any particular rituals that you'd point George to in the companion Coda document in this session that you think he should especially take a look at for an early stage company?
Actually, there's one we're writing now that's actually not in the doc yet, but I'll describe it a little bit. But it's an observation on planning, and I think planning is one of the categories of rituals that most evolves as a company grows. I mean, many others I think just sort of naturally evolve, but planning often has reset moments. And I think that early on, planning tends to be very simple. When Coda started, we had 6 people. Planning was a half-hour check-in. This is what we're going to get done in the next couple of weeks. And it was really, we were always on the same page. We're talking all the time. There wasn't that much discussion that had to happen about it. And then it grows and grows and grows, and you'll find that there's a few key transitions that happen as you grow as a company. So early on, sometimes people call them stories, sometimes people call them OKRs. A lot of different terminology for it, but there's generally a shared list between the whole company. And at some point that grows, and you have some level of split. And this team is going to plan their OKRs or their stories, and this team's going to plan theirs. And now you have to do coordination. And all planning goes from, hey, let's just all agree on what we're doing as a company, to you first agree on what you think you're doing as a team, you agree with what you're doing as a team, and now it becomes peer-based. Planning goes to becoming peer-based. At some point, you then need to find a way to inject company priorities back into that. We use a process called Big Rocks, where there's great write-ups on it, and there's a fantastic YouTube video of how you think about filling rocks in a jar. And this professor that goes and sits in front of a class and puts all these big rocks into this jar, and he says, is the jar full? And all the students say, yeah, of course it's full. And then he takes about a bunch of small rocks, and they put the small rocks into the jar, and they all fill all the holes between the big rocks. Is the jar full now? And say, oh yeah, it's definitely full now. And then he goes and takes a bunch of sand, and he pours sand into this thing. It fills all the holes between the small rocks, and he now he says, is it full now? And they know a little better. They say, we think so. And then he goes and grabs a beer, and he pours a beer into this jar, and and now it kind of all fills up. And he says, okay, the lessons out of this are, if you plan your big rocks first, there's plenty of room for the small rocks. But if you do it the other way around, it doesn't work. And second, there's always room for a beer. So I think at some point you go from, we all plan together, we do peer-based planning, to some form of big rock planning. Company comes up with priorities. These are the big things you need to work on. And then the sort of fourth step in planning, I think, is planning becomes about resources. And it's I'll often ask companies, what is your planning artifact? How do you know when it's done? And the larger the company, the more the planning artifact is a headcount chart, or it's a budget. And it says, okay, we're done with planning because this team gets 4 people and this team gets 3 people, and so on. And I think it's very natural that those steps happen. But I think that's one ritual in particular that will evolve. And I think it's really important to manage those stages. And you don't want to jump too fast I think it's actually kind of unfortunate when companies get into that state of headcount is the signal on what the priorities are. It's not usually a very good signal, but it's inevitable. And I think every big company lands on that. So that's one ritual. How you do planning, I think, is probably one of the ones that will probably reset over and over and over again as you grow as a company.
That's great guidance. We've got another question here from Brian Devaney, who asks, curious how you approach testing new rituals to see if they're golden or not. And then I especially like the second part of this question, then having the flexibility to roll them back if they don't work. So how would you approach that?
I mean, there are some rituals that there's no rollback process needed. They'll fizzle out. If they don't work, they'll just gradually go away. And you start this new one-on-one document for your team. People use it or they won't. And if they don't, then there's not much you can do about it. You go try again with a slightly different approach. There are some rituals where their life cycle doesn't have a natural death. I mean, the way you do planning is a good example of that. Like, however you choose to do it, you're going to try a process, and then you're going to get feedback on it, and then you're going to decide. I mean, for us, we use our quarterly pulse survey as a way to look at that, and we've reset many things. Where we'll go look at it, and our planning process has evolved pretty substantially. Where you can see it in our charts. Where one of the questions we ask is, do you know what the goals of the company are? Do you know how your work aligns to the goals of the company? There's a series of questions that work that way, and you'll see this clear dip where when our planning process starts breaking, people start saying, I don't actually know what we're working on, or I don't know how I connect to it. And then you'll go and you'll reinvent. And so I think you want some signal on, is this working? And for us, our pulse survey is a great way to do it. But I think it's different for every company.
And I think I've got one more I can squeeze in before I hand it back to hand back to Michael. So This is from Angie C. As a company scales, how do you share the decisions made across organizations so that it is codified as a ritual?
Yeah, I mean, on the earlier question, what do early companies, which rituals form early on? So we talked about planning, but this is the other one. How the company makes decisions often gets embedded in a culture, and it becomes hard to change. And there are companies that have a very top-down decision-making structure. There are companies that have a very a decision-making structure that's optimized towards speed. There's the companies optimized towards thoroughness, so on. And how you design that is really important. I'm a big believer in having a distinct forum for your big decision making. We do a thing we call Catalyst, as mentioned earlier, and it's set up as 2 weekly forums, Mondays and Thursdays. So two half-hour slots each. So there's 4 slots. People sign up for it, and they go into a Coda doc and sign up. There's a few different things we've built around that are helpful. So anybody can sign up for anything. By default, there's an audience. You fill in some columns on. We have our names of our roles, but most companies would call them some version of who's the reviewer, who's your approver, who's the contributor, so on. And then there's one column we keep is it open to the company or not? And by default, all of ours are open to the company. So if you want to come, you can come. You don't have to. And then we built a set of automations around it. And so one of the automations is before the meeting, a note will go out to each of those different roles with a reminder of how those roles work at Coda. For example, for us, we don't call them approvers, we call them brain trust. We say the role of brain trust at Coda is X, and it just goes out to them in Slack, and they get a little notice saying, you've invited, this is the meeting, it's gonna happen on Monday, this is the pre-read, and here's your role. Your role as brain trust is to provide lift, not drag. It's one of our philosophies on how that works. And then a second one goes out afterwards that syndicates the conclusions back to the company. And so you fill in what happened and it gets syndicated back out. You don't even have to do anything. And that's one of the ways we've turned that into a standing forum that brings the company together. So.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Michael, over to you.
Well, I know you've got to go at the top of the hour, Jono, so I want to say thank you very much for doing a great job there. And Shishir, always as illuminating as ever. And to the audience, thanks for the great questions. You know, I think appropriately, given the topic, we had a lot of them oriented towards this rituals. And I think it's fantastic. It's actually a great basis on which to think about things. Just to say it though, you know, if you're using a doc or a sheet or a table or whatever, try Coda. It's just been fun for us to see how quickly the team has adopted it. And I think you'll have a lot of fun with it for lots of different users. So my job is to make sure that you are up to date on the things that are going on at Underscore. And so just to say it, save the date for Boston Reconnect. In this virtual world, we've created a couple of days where people can get interactive and actually can be participating together and learning from each other. And we'll be excited to see you there. And of course, by the way, on future core collectives, which are also up on our website. And then finally, Jenny has posted a link to events. So you'll see the next couple that are coming up, so you can follow there. I want to make sure that as part of this, by the way, we get feedback so we can keep doing better. So there's also a survey that we'll just put a link up to too. So get your feedback on how can we improve this. With that, I'll say thank you very much to all of you for participating, and a particularly big thanks to Shishir for providing the stimulation for today. Look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.